The heavy scent of pine trees and fresh hay filled the air as Ella stood at the farmhouse door. Her boots, worn thin from walking miles, sank slightly into the soft earth beneath her. In her hand, she clutched the piece of paper that could change everything. The land deed Thomas Wade had placed in her hands. She didn't fully understand why she'd said yes to the job. It wasn't about the money. It was about the need for something, anything, to start anew. But as she looked up at the old farmhouse, a silent promise crossed her mind. She wouldn't leave without changing her life. But first, let me tell you how they met. Ella had never planned on being a farmhand. In fact, just months ago, she'd been working as a nurse in a bustling city hospital. But after her mother's sudden death and mounting medical bills, she'd been forced to let go of the life she'd built. It wasn't just the hospital bills or the funeral costs that had taken everything from her. It was the shattered dreams. Dreams of finishing medical school, of starting her own practice, of building something meaningful. But now, she was standing at the edge of someone else's life. She hadn't had the money for a coach or even a proper card, so she'd made her way here on foot. Her only possession was a small satchel, one that contained the only belongings that truly mattered: a faded photograph of her mother and a letter from the hospital demanding payment she could never afford. As she walked along the dirt road, the farmhouse came into view. It sat like a quiet sentry at the edge of the land, its old wooden frame sagging with age. The land itself stretched on forever, dotted with fields, grazing cattle, and a small barn that looked like it might collapse with the next gust of wind. Her heart sank. What was she doing here? As she reached the front door, the sound of creaking floorboards could be heard inside, followed by the rustling of an old chair being pushed back. The door opened, and there he stood, Thomas Wade, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of hard work and solitude. He was holding a land deed in one hand, his eyes tired but kind. "I'm Thomas Wade," he said, his voice deep but warm, as though it had been years since he'd spoken to anyone. "You must be Ella." She nodded, feeling the weight of her own exhaustion. "Yes, I came about the job," she said softly. He held out the land deed. "This here is your contract, $200 a week, room and board, and I expect good, honest work." His eyes searched hers for a moment, perhaps questioning if she could meet the standards of this lonely, difficult place. Her stomach churned. It wasn't much, not nearly enough to pay off her debts. But it was something, and for now, that was all that mattered. "I'll take the job," she replied. Thomas gave a small nod, the corners of his lips lifting in what could almost be called a smile. "Good. I'll show you to your quarters." As they walked toward the small guest cottage beside the house, Ella's heart skipped a beat. The cottage was small but cozy, tucked under a sprawling oak tree. It looked as if it had been untouched for years. She couldn't help but notice the faint scent of lavender in the air and the soft creak of the door as she stepped inside. And then she saw it, a wooden trunk in the corner of the room, worn and faded. It had the same faded color as the rocking chair in the corner of the living room. It was clear that it had belonged to someone who had lived here long before her. There were no signs of it being cleared out. "Grace," she whispered to herself, remembering the name from the old advertisement. The name echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the woman whose legacy lingered in this quiet place. A woman who had once lived here with Thomas. And now she was gone. Ella's thoughts were interrupted as Thomas stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her. "I'll let you get settled in. Dinner's at 6. She nodded, though her mind was still racing. Thomas Wade had invited her here, not just out of kindness, but out of necessity. The land was falling apart, the house too. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the same kind of hunger she had buried deep inside herself. As she unpacked, she thought about the future, about what she had come here to do. The pay would help, but it wasn't the real reason she had come. She had come for a chance to rebuild, to start over, to put the broken pieces of her life back together. Across the yard, Thomas stood at the window, watching her silently. He, too, was broken in his own way. The weight of years of isolation had worn him down. But this land, this place, they were all he had left. And he would do anything to hold on to them. In that moment, the two of them, so different yet so similar, stood in silence, both desperate in their own way. Desperate for something that could fix what was broken. And the story, just like the land, would begin to grow. Desperation meets opportunity. Both were broken. Both were looking for a way out. And maybe, just maybe, they would find it together. The first 4 weeks at the farmhouse passed in a blur of routine and quiet understanding. Every morning, Ella would rise before dawn, the soft chirp of crickets still hanging in the air, and prepare breakfast for Thomas. He had never been much for fancy meals, so she kept it simple: eggs, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to put hair in her chest. She would cook while he sat at the old wooden table, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug, staring out the window at the land. No words were needed between them at first. There was an unspoken respect, her for his way of life, and he for the presence of someone willing to help. Each day followed the same pattern: feeding the horses, cleaning the barn, and patching up fences. Every chore felt like an act of grace, as if they were both silently healing from wounds they'd never spoken of. As the days wore on, their interactions deepened, small gestures that bridged the gap between strangers. Thomas would leave an extra pair of boots on the porch when she was out in the field, the soles worn thin from too many miles. Sometimes he would leave her aspirin on the table when he noticed her grimace from the ache in her back. Little by little, they began to talk more. The silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. In the evenings, Thomas would sit on the porch and tell her stories about the land, how it had once been rich with crops and cattle, how he and Grace had built everything they had from nothing. He'd laugh when he spoke of Grace's stubbornness and how, even when she was sick, she had insisted on planting her garden every spring. Ella listened intently, her heart growing heavier with each word. She had never known a love like that, a love that spanned decades, a love that had seen both the rise and fall of fortunes. She would often catch herself staring at the empty chair beside him, imagining what Grace had looked like sitting there, hearing the same stories, sharing the same space. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house filled with a soft, golden light, Ella overheard Thomas talking in the barn. She wasn't sure who he was talking to, but she recognized the name he spoke: Grace. It was a quiet conversation, and though she couldn't make out the words, she felt the weight of it. It was the first time she had heard him speak her name in such a sorrowful way. She didn't ask about it, not immediately. The next morning, when she brought him breakfast, he was quieter than usual. But the routine continued, the silence settling between them like a comfortable blanket. In the third week, just as Ella was beginning to feel a sense of belonging, Thomas collapsed in the barn. She was out by the fence, working with the horses, when she heard a loud crash followed by a grunt. She ran towards the barn, her heart racing, and found him on the ground, his face pale, a sheen of sweat covering his forehead. Without hesitation, she knelt beside him, her hand shaking as she helped him sit up. "Thomas?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. He waved her off, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice cracked. But Ella could see it. Something was terribly wrong. His skin had an unhealthy tint, his breaths were shallow, and his hands trembled. She rushed to fetch the doctor, hitching up the old cart, and drove as fast as she dared down the dirt road. The ride was bumpy and uncomfortable, but Ella didn't care. She kept her eyes on the road, heart pounding with worry. The doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Farley, was already waiting when they arrived, his gray hair tousled from the wind. He took one look at Thomas and nodded gravely. "It's his heart," Dr. Farley said after examining him. "And maybe more." The doctor was kind but blunt. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. "I'm afraid Thomas doesn't have much time left. Maybe 3 or 4 months, if he's lucky." The words hit Ella like a punch to the gut. Thomas had never said a word about his illness, not even hinted at it. Yet here it was plain as day. He was dying. On the ride back, the silence between them was thick, oppressive. They didn't speak at first, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But as the cart bumped along the road, Thomas finally broke the silence. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, his voice raw. Ella glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed deeply. "Didn't want to burden you. You've already got enough to deal with." There was something vulnerable in his voice, something raw that she hadn't expected. It struck her then how much he had been hiding, how much pain he had carried alone. As they passed the fields, the once thriving crops, now withered and dried, she realized just how much this land meant to him. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was everything he had left. She could feel the weight of his loss pressing down on him, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of his loneliness. The next few days were filled with quiet moments and tentative conversations. The routine continued, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were two people facing the inevitable, learning to share in each other's pain. The farm that had once felt like a cold, unwelcoming place had started to feel like home. By the time the first month passed, Ella had become more than just a caretaker. She had become a witness to Thomas's life, to his story, and she had become part of the land itself. It was a quiet, slow kind of connection. Nothing dramatic, no grand declarations, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt like they had a place where they belonged. Their shared silence spoke volumes, and in that silence, they found a comfort that neither had expected. They were strangers no longer. They had become companions, sharing the weight of the world in their own quiet way. And in those moments, when the sun would set behind the distant hills and the stars would begin to fill the sky, it felt like perhaps they were healing each other, one small act of kindness at a time. The next few weeks at the farmhouse passed quietly, each day blending into the other as the weight of the unspoken grew between them. Ella could feel it more keenly now. Thomas's growing fragility, the way he seemed to shrink a little more each day, not just in his body but in his spirit. His presence, once commanding and sure, had softened, and Ella found herself stepping into the role of caretaker more than she ever expected. It wasn't just the physical chores anymore, the feeding and the cleaning, but it was his soul she tended to in the quiet moments. The land itself had become a reflection of him, weathered, fading, but still holding on to something precious. One rainy afternoon, when the air was thick with the scent of wet earth, Thomas invited her into the parlor with a thick leather album in his hands. "Come sit with me," he said, his voice low but gentle. She did as she was asked, settling into the armchair opposite him. He opened the album, revealing faded photographs of a woman Ella had heard about but never met, Grace, Thomas's late wife. The pictures were old, sepia-toned, and worn at the edges, each one a testament to a life lived in love. There was Grace in her youth, her smile as radiant as the sun, her eyes full of warmth and kindness. As Thomas turned the pages, he spoke softly about their life together, about the farm they had built from nothing, about the plans they had made, dreams of growing old together on this land. "We were like one soul," Thomas murmured, his fingers brushing over a photo of them standing in front of the house, young and full of hope. Grace was the heart of this place. She kept everything together. He paused, his voice catching slightly. "I don't know what to do without her." Ella sat quietly, letting him speak. She understood more than he realized. She could see the love between them in the photographs, the way they stood together, as if nothing in the world could touch them. But now, Grace was gone, and all that was left was the land, the house, and Thomas's memories. As the rain poured down outside, Ella couldn't help but feel the weight of his loss in her bones. Later that week, a visitor arrived at the farm. He came in a hired carriage, dressed in expensive clothes that didn't quite match the rough, rustic world of the farm. Derek, Thomas's distant nephew, had been expected for a while, though no one had ever mentioned him. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a sharp smile, his posture a little too straight, like he was always on alert. Ella could sense something cold in him from the moment he stepped onto the porch. "Thomas," Derek said, his voice smooth but insincere. "I hope you're doing well." Thomas greeted him with a nod, though his eyes narrowed slightly. It was clear there was something between them, something unspoken. Derek's gaze slid past Thomas to Ella, sizing her up with a calculated glance. "And you must be Ella," he said, his tone polite but not warm. Ella simply nodded, not offering much in return. The dinner that followed was tense, filled with long pauses and awkward silences. Derek asked about the land, about the crops, about everything that mattered to Thomas. It was clear he wasn't here to check on family. He was here for something else. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the silence settled back over the room, Derek and Thomas had a private conversation. Ella didn't overhear all of it, but she could hear Derek's voice growing sharper, more insistent. "You should sell this place," Derek was saying, his tone smooth but edged with something dangerous. "Move to a care facility. It's what Grace would have wanted." There was a pause, and then Derek added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm your heir, you know. By law, I inherit everything if you pass." Thomas's response was clipped, his voice low. "I'm not selling." The finality in his tone was unmistakable, but Derek wasn't done. "Don't make this difficult, Uncle. You've got months left, maybe less. You're just hanging on for some stubborn reason. This land is valuable. The sooner you sell, the better for all of us." Ella could feel the tension building, but she stayed out of sight, not wanting to interrupt. When Derek finally left, he turned to her with a thin smile. "You've got a good deal here, but don't be fooled. This man doesn't have much time left. Don't get too comfortable." His words were a warning, a threat wrapped in a polite smile. As he disappeared down the dirt road, Ella stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowed. Derek's visit had unsettled her. His polished exterior was just that, a shell. Beneath it, she saw a man who would do anything to get what he wanted. Thomas stood in the doorway behind her, watching Derek leave with a quiet intensity. When he spoke, his voice was tight. "He wants me to sell the land, move away. He thinks he could just take it all." Ella glanced at him, her heart heavy. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between pride and the reality of his situation. "But you won't," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, I won't." But even as he said it, Ella could see the cracks in his resolve. Derek's words had gotten under his skin, and she knew it would only be a matter of time before the pressure would mount again. As the days passed, the quiet tension between them grew. Thomas had always been a man of pride, but now that pride seemed like a fragile thing. He'd built everything he had on this land, and it was all slipping away, piece by piece. He spoke less about the past, more about the future, but it was clear that the future was a burden. And then, one evening, after dinner, Thomas spoke to Ella in a way he never had before. "I have to make a decision," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undertone of resignation. "I don't know how much time I have left, and Derek's already circling. He wants this place, wants to tear it all apart." Ella felt a chill run through her. She had seen the way Derek had looked at the land, the way his words had dripped with greed. Thomas had always known that the land was worth a lot, but now it felt like it was worth even more to Derek. "But I'm not giving up," Thomas continued, his voice hardening. This land is my legacy. I won't let him take it." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the decision that lay before him. Ella knew that Thomas was standing at a crossroads. Derek's arrival had put everything into perspective. This wasn't just about Thomas's health. It was about legacy, about preserving the land for the future, about holding on to something that mattered. As Thomas stood in the doorway, watching the setting sun cast long shadows over the land, Ella realized that there was more at stake here than just survival. There was a fight coming, and it wasn't just about the land. It was about holding on to everything that made life worth living. And in the quiet of the farmhouse, both of them knew that they had to make a choice: give in to the pressure or fight for what mattered. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about fighting to live. 2 weeks had passed since Derek's visit, and the air had shifted in ways Ella couldn't fully understand. The tension that had been building between her and Thomas had deepened, not in anger or frustration, but in something more subtle, something fragile. The tasks around the farm had become more routine. She could almost do them in her sleep now. The horses, the barn, the garden, all of it had become second nature. But it wasn't the chores that were weighing heavily on her mind anymore. It was Thomas. She could see the decline in him now. The way his hands trembled as he reached for a cup. The way he moved slower, as if every step required more effort than the last. Yet, despite all of this, he kept going, kept teaching her about the land, kept sharing the small things that mattered. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch in the fading light, the silence between them comfortable but pregnant with unspoken words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields, Thomas turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ella," he began, his voice steady but low, "I've been thinking." She looked at him, curiosity rising. "About what?" "About this land," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "About what happens after I'm gone." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Ella's heart skipped a beat, though she kept her expression neutral. She knew this was coming. He had been growing weaker by the day, and Derek's words still echoed in the back of her mind. Thomas couldn't keep the land alone, not like this. He had been holding on, not just for himself, but for something he couldn't explain. Ella didn't have the words for it, but she could feel it too. This land, this life was all they had left. "I can't let it go," Thomas continued, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "It's all I have left of Grace. It's the only thing that still means something." Ella watched him for a moment, seeing the pain in his eyes, the conflict that had worn him down over time. She had always known that this wasn't just a farm to him. It was a living memory, a testament to a life he had shared with someone he had loved deeply. "I won't let him take it," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't let Derek have it." Ella felt her chest tighten. The unspoken fear in his voice was clear. He was ready to fight, but he didn't have the strength to do it alone. And that was where she came in. "I'll help," she said softly without thinking. The words left her mouth before she could fully comprehend their meaning. She had no idea what she was agreeing to, but in that moment, something inside her clicked. Thomas needed help, and for the first time in a long while, Ella realized that she had something to offer. Not just the land, not just the work, but herself. "You don't have to do this alone," she added, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet conviction. The two of them sat in silence, the evening stretching out around them. The world seemed to slow down, as if holding its breath. Ella's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing with the possibilities of what this could mean. She wasn't just here to work anymore. She was here to fight for something. She was here to fight for the land, for the memories, for Thomas. And in some strange way, she was fighting for herself too. It was then that Thomas turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to read her soul. His expression softened, and for a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man he once was, strong, confident, full of purpose. "I need your help, Ella," he said quietly. "I need you to marry me." The words struck her like a bolt of lightning. She didn't expect them. She couldn't have prepared for them. For a moment, all she could do was stare at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marry me," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "Not for love, but for the land. If I don't have an heir, Derek will take everything. I need you to marry me, so the land stays in the family. So the land stays with me, with us." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was asking, but it didn't make sense. It was one thing to help him out of kindness, out of necessity, but this, This was different. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure how to feel. There was no romance in his words, no soft touch, no gentle proposal. It was practical, cold even. Yet, as she looked at him, she saw something else. Desperation, but also hope. Thomas wasn't asking her for a love story. He was asking for a way to hold on, a way to protect what was left. And in that moment, Ella realized something that had been growing inside her. She wasn't just here because she needed a job. She wasn't here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because this land, this life, was now part of her too. "I'm not doing this for you," she said, her voice firm now, her chest rising with a newfound strength. "I'm doing this for the land, for Grace, for the future." Thomas's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you'll do it because you believe in it too." Ella didn't say anything. She simply nodded. She knew what was at stake now. She understood the weight of what he was asking. And in some strange way, she knew she could do it. She could stand by him, not as a wife in the traditional sense, but as a partner in something far greater. "You're not alone," she whispered, the words coming from a place deeper than she had expected. "I'll be here. I'll be here until the end." And with that, they shook hands. It wasn't a gesture of love or affection, but it was a promise. A promise that the land would be protected, that they would face what was coming together. "Mrs. Wade," Thomas said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "at least for a little while." The words were simple, but they meant everything. In that moment, Ella knew that everything had changed. They weren't just two people caught in a desperate situation anymore. They were partners, bound by a shared understanding of what was at stake. And with that, they began to face the future, not with fear, but with a quiet determination. The land was theirs, and together they would keep it. The days after their agreement were a blur of activity, each one more uncertain than the last. The weight of their new arrangement settled over the farm like a heavy fog, thick and all-encompassing. The decision to marry Thomas, not out of love, but for the survival of the land, gnawed at Ella. She woke each morning with a sense of dread, her mind racing with thoughts of the future and what this promise would mean for her. Yet, as the weeks wore on, she began to realize that her life had become entwined with this place in ways she hadn't anticipated. The house that once felt cold now felt like her own. The field she tended to have begun to grow and flourish under her hands, and even the horses seemed to trust her more with each passing day. She had a role here now, a purpose, something she hadn't had in years. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when she questioned what she had gotten herself into. Thomas, for his part, seemed both relieved and burdened by their arrangement. He didn't speak of it much, but she could see it in his eyes, the flicker of fear and hope, of things unsaid. He wasn't getting better. His condition worsened slowly but surely. His cough became more frequent, his energy drained quicker, and his time on the porch grew shorter each day. Despite this, he insisted on teaching her everything about the land, about the crops, the seasons, and the animals. There were moments of connection between them, moments when they would sit together in the fading light and talk about the past, about Grace, about how they had both come to be here, in this place at this time. But there were also moments of silence, when the weight of their unspoken words seemed to press down on them, filling the space between them with an awkward tension. As the days passed, it became clear to Ella that this wasn't just about saving the land anymore. It was about saving something deeper, something she hadn't even realized she had lost until now. She had come here with nothing but a desire to start over, to escape her past. But in Thomas's quiet presence, in the rhythm of the farm, she began to rediscover who she was. She wasn't just a woman running from her past anymore. She was someone with a future, someone with a purpose. And that purpose, as complicated and difficult as it was tied to this land, this family, and to Thomas. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, it wasn't the grand affair she had imagined for herself, not even close. It was simple, understated, and entirely legal. They had the ceremony in the small town courthouse, just a few miles down the road, with only the lawyer and Thomas's nurse as witnesses. The ceremony was brief, the judge's words formal, and before she knew it, she was signing her new name on the dotted line, Ella Wade. There was no grand vow, no kiss to seal the union, just a handshake between them as the finality of their decision settled in. The simplicity of it felt almost anticlimactic, but it was exactly what they both needed. There was no time for grand gestures, no space for anything more than what was necessary to secure the future of the farm. Derek's fury didn't take long to show itself. Word of their marriage spread quickly, and within days, Derek was back at the farmhouse, seething with rage. He had no intention of letting this go. He arrived as expected, in his hired carriage, his suit sharp and impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the rough, weathered land that surrounded them. His face was a mask of barely concealed contempt as he demanded to speak with Thomas. "This is ridiculous," Derek spat as soon as he stepped onto the porch. "This is an obvious ploy, undue influence, elder abuse. You're not even in your right mind, Uncle." Ella stood behind Thomas, her spine straight, her hands clasped together in front of her. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made something inside her tighten with anger. "Everything was done legally," Thomas replied, his voice calm but firm. "I made the decision. Ella and I are married, and the land stays with me." Derek's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this. I will contest the will. You think you can pull one over on me, but I'll fight this until the end." His parting words were a threat, not a warning. "I'll make your life hell, Thomas. And hers too." As he turned to leave, his words hung in the air like poison. Ella didn't speak, but she could feel the weight of his malice. Derek's return had made it clear this wasn't just about land or money. It was about control. Thomas wasn't just fighting to stay alive. He was fighting for his legacy, for the memory of Grace, and for the future that he hoped to leave behind. And now, with Derek's threat looming over them, it felt like the battle had only just begun. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and quiet conversations. Thomas continued to grow weaker, his body betraying him in ways that were hard to ignore. The coughing fits were more frequent, the pain in his chest more intense. Yet he refused to leave the farm. "I won't go," he said repeatedly, whenever the subject of a care facility came up. "Not while there's still life in this place." Ella watched him struggle, both physically and emotionally. He was trying to hold on, to do everything he could to protect what little was left. But she could see the cracks in his resolve, the way he clung to the land, the house, the memories, as if they were the only things that could give him purpose in these final days. And yet, there were moments when he would sit with her on the porch, his gaze distant, and tell her more about Grace, more about their life together, as though he were trying to leave behind a piece of himself for her. It was in these quiet moments that Ella began to understand something. This wasn't just about saving the land. It was about saving what mattered, about giving meaning to the years that remained. Thomas wasn't asking her to love him. He was asking her to be his witness, to carry on the legacy of a life that had been built from nothing. The thought weighed heavily on her, but she also realized something else. She was ready for it. She was ready to stand by him, not out of obligation, but out of a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for something, to protect it, to fight for it. And as the days stretched on, as Thomas's strength faded and Derek's threats loomed closer, Ella began to see that their bond, fragile as it was, could withstand anything. She would help him keep this place, this memory of Grace, alive, not because of the land or the money, but because it was what they both needed. She wasn't just here to watch him die. She was here to help him live, to help him leave behind a legacy worth remembering. And no matter what Derek tried, she knew that they would fight until the end, together. It was a promise, a quiet one, but it was hers. And in the stillness of the farmhouse, The dying man and the woman who had been hired to save him began to fight not just for survival, but for something far more powerful: hope. The weeks passed, and the tension around the farm seemed to settle into a quiet hum, an undercurrent of anticipation and grief that never quite lifted. Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate, though he fought every day to hold on to what little life he had left. Ella stayed by his side, her presence unwavering, a constant comfort for him in the growing silence that surrounded them. She spent her days working the land, caring for the horses, and handling the duties Thomas could no longer manage. But at night, she would sit by his bedside, reading to him from the old books he had kept on the shelves. She had come to know his favorite stories by heart, the tales of adventure and loss, of triumphs and failures. But now those stories seemed to fade into the background. It was as though the land itself had taken a life of its own, a life that both Thomas and Ella clung to, not for survival, but for something more profound, something beyond the physical. Each morning, she would bring him his coffee, a ritual they had shared for years, though now it was more of a comfort for her than for him. The quiet moments of the past were no longer enough to keep the inevitable at bay. One night, just as the stars began to shine through the window, Thomas's breathing grew labored. Ella had been sitting with him, her hand resting gently on his when she noticed the change. She had been prepared for it, in some ways, though nothing could truly prepare her for the moment when she would lose him. She called for the nurse, who arrived quickly, and together they managed to make Thomas as comfortable as possible, though there was no denying the truth that hung in the air. He was slipping away. In the quiet of that night, as the hours passed, Ella stayed by his side, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories and regrets, of words unsaid and promises made. Thomas's face was pale, his features softened by the weight of his illness, but there was still a strength in his eyes, a flicker of recognition as he turned his gaze toward her. "Ella," he whispered, his voice barely audible, the words like a prayer. She leaned in closer, her heart aching as she listened to him. "You've done it," he said softly, the words coming with a finality that felt both painful and peaceful. "You've made this land live again. You've given me a reason to hold on a little longer." His hand, though frail, squeezed hers, and she could feel the warmth of it, the last vestige of the man who had built this life from the ground up. Ella didn't know how to respond. She had never been good at saying goodbye, but she knew that in this moment, there was no need for words. He had already said everything that needed to be said. She sat with him through the night, the two of them alone in the quiet farmhouse, until the first rays of dawn began to break through the window. And then, just as the world outside began to stir with the new day, Thomas took his final breath. It was a quiet passing, one that seemed to echo the stillness of the land itself. There were no grand gestures, no final cries, just a quiet release, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to let go. Ella sat there for a long time, holding his hand, unsure of what to do next. The world outside had changed. The man she had come to know and care for was gone, and the land that had been the center of their world was now left in her hands. The grief was overwhelming, but it was also a quiet kind of grief, the kind that settles deep inside you and doesn't let go. She had promised him she would take care of the land, and now, with him gone, that promise was hers to keep. The funeral was a quiet affair, as expected. Neighbors came, friends from the town, but there was no fanfare, no public outpouring of emotion. It was a simple ceremony, held in the small cemetery just behind the farmhouse, where Grace had been buried all those years ago. Thomas's headstone was already there, weathered and worn by time, and now his name was added beside it, a final resting place for two people who had shared a life together and now would share an eternity. Ella stood at the gravesite, her hand resting on the cool stone, her heart heavy with the weight of the loss. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but what she hadn't anticipated was how the land would feel now that Thomas was gone. The farmhouse, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, was now eerily silent. The fields that had been so full of life now seemed barren, as though the land itself had taken on the sorrow that filled her heart. And then, just as the grief threatened to consume her, Derek arrived. The sight of his expensive carriage, his sharp suit, and his cold eyes filled her with dread. She had known this day would come, that Derek would return to try and take what he believed was his. But she wasn't ready for it. He stepped down from the carriage, his eyes scanning the property with a look of disdain. "It's over, you know," Derek said, his voice smooth but filled with an unmistakable arrogance. "Thomas is gone. This place is mine now." Ella stood her ground, her body tense, but there was a calmness in her that she hadn't expected. "It's not yours," she said, her voice firm. "You'll never take it." Derek's eyes narrowed. "Don't make this difficult. You don't have the resources to fight me. You're alone now. This is mine by law." But as Derek moved closer, Ellen knew that he was underestimating her. She had learned more from Thomas than he had realized. She knew the land. She knew how to work it, how to keep it alive, and she knew the power of what she had promised. "You'll have to do more than threaten me," she said quietly. "You'll have to fight me, and I will not back down." Derek sneered, but Ella stood tall, her resolve unshaken. She wasn't alone anymore. She had the land, she had the memories of Thomas and Grace, and she had the strength of a woman who had fought for something far greater than herself. The legal battle that followed was long and grueling. Derek threw everything he could at her: legal maneuvers, threats, and even false accusations. But Ella refused to be intimidated. She had already fought for her place here, and she wasn't about to let him take it away. Finally, after months of back and forth in court, the judge ruled in Ella's favor. Derek was defeated, his claims dismissed, and the land remained in her hands. The victory was sweet, but it came with a heavy cost. Derek left with a final, bitter remark, but Ella didn't care. The land was hers. The legacy was hers, and she would honor it, not just for Thomas and Grace, but for herself. 6 months later, the farm was a different place. The fields were alive with new crops. The barn had been repaired, and the house, though weathered, had become a home again. Ella had turned the farm into a thriving operation, running a riding program for local kids, offering a place where young people could connect with nature and learn the value of hard work. She had made it her own. One afternoon, as she walked through the fields, a young girl named Maya came up to her, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at the horses. "This place is magic," Maya said, her voice filled with awe. Ella smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It is," she replied, "and it's all because people believed in it." The land was no longer a place of loss. It was a place of life, a place of new beginnings. As Ella worked, she could feel the presence of Thomas and Grace with her, their spirits intertwined with the soil beneath her feet. She would never forget them, but she had made their dream her own. And in doing so, she had found a new sense of purpose, a new chance to live, to grow, and to build something lasting. One day, as she was working near the barn, a man arrived on horseback. He was tall, with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. His name was Dr. Marcus, a local veterinarian, and he had heard about Ella's work with the horses. He was impressed by how well she had cared for them. After checking the horses, he asked if he could return sometime to see how the program was going. "Not for the horses," he said with a smile, "but for the coffee." Ella smiled back, her heart light. "I'd like that," she said, the promise of something new in her voice. It was then, standing there with the horses grazing peacefully nearby, that she realized how far she had come. This was her life now. This was her legacy, and it was just the beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the fields. Ella stood tall, her heart full, knowing that the land she had fought for would continue to grow, would continue to live long after her. The battle had been won, and now it was time to live. Time to make something new from the ashes of the past. And so, Ella moved forward, her promise fulfilled, her future bright. She had inherited more than land. She had inherited a second chance at life.